Welcome to the Theological Lens, where our goal is to see the world, our daily walks, and our worship transformed by the truth of Jesus Christ. Our content is saturated with Scripture, overflowing with faith, and rooted in the good news of the cross. Each episode will proclaim the name of the Lord, calling us to submit to His ways and live lives that glorify Him. With hearts full of thankfulness, we'll explore how Jesus shapes everything, our decisions, our worldview, and our worship, always pointing back to the hope and transformation found in Him.
Welcome to the Theological Lens. My name is Dr. Lynelle Buchanan, and I'm so glad that you've chosen to join me today. I've been working through a series called Lessons Learned in the Dark, and these are things that the Lord has been teaching me through what has arguably been the most difficult year of my life. And some of these lessons were probably makeup quizzes, things that God has been trying to teach me for decades, but they have come into much sharper relief in the last year of my life after the closure of Clark Summit University, where I worked for 24 years, and my life had very much been centered there. Now, the first episode of these Lessons Learned in the Dark came out 2 weeks ago, and apparently you guys really enjoyed it. Maybe it's because I cried a lot. People aren't used to me crying. And I would suggest that maybe tonight I might have some of the same problems. So I'll do my best to share my heart with you and be pretty vulnerable. And I hope that you'll have grace. And again, for those of you who are sympathetic criers, I apologize in advance. So these lessons that God has been teaching me have been things that He's been preparing for me. I think He's been trying to groom my heart to be in a place to hear Him and to understand these truths. And some of these truths are reflected in the theological box that contains my chaos that I shared in episode 1 of the Theological Lens. If you go back and listen to that one, if you missed it, it is about 6 core theological truths about our God. That if I have a certainty of those things, if I have those anchored really, really well in my heart, it helps me go through even the most challenging times with a lot more grace, a lot more success. And the things that we're going to talk about today actually relate to 3 of those core truths about God that are reflected in that box. So those 3 truths are the fact that God is involved and purposeful. He is involved in our lives, and He is doing things on purpose. And then also the truth that God is good and loving. And the things that He's accomplishing in our lives reflect that goodness and His love for us. Then the last one is the fact that God is faithful. And so the things that I want to share with you today are things where I saw those truths of God so well represented in the last year, and the things that I've learned because of what God has done through my circumstances. So to understand how He's developed these truths in me, I kind of have to go back in time a little bit. As I was growing up, my father pastored in small churches, and the economics of ministry at the time really meant that my family, we spent a lot of time depending on the provision of God. And He did so many times in such amazing supernatural kinds of ways. We were so blessed. We became intimately aware of Jehovah-Jireh. That's a name for God that we are first introduced to in the Old Testament. It's when Abraham was going to sacrifice to God, and he offered to God the desire of his heart, his son, and the Lord instead provided a ram for his sacrifice. And this is the God who saw the need and provided the need. That's what Jehovah-Jireh means, the God who sees and the God who provides. And growing up in this ministry family, I got to see this God who saw our needs and provided over and over and over again in some wild supernatural ways. So I could talk your ear off about ways that God provided for our family, because He just came through for us in so many amazing ways. We would have serious needs, and we would get down on our knees and we would pray and present those needs to our God, and then sit back and watch the glory of God rain down on our lives as He met those needs. So it was my privilege, as I taught at Clark Summit University, that every fall in Introduction to Counseling, when we got to the last class before Thanksgiving break, I devoted that class to this important topic of nurturing gratitude and thankfulness in our hearts. It's such an important thing for us to do. And I would do so by sharing some of the stories of God's goodness in my life while I was growing up. And this served a couple dual functions for me. First of all, it let me review those stories. And when you have seen God do great things in your life, it's something that we do need to review. In fact, God told the children of Israel that they needed to pass on the stories of the wonders that he has done, because if not, they would forget. He said over and over again, remember and do not forget. Remember and do not forget. And the reason he said that is because as humans, we are so prone to forget. So he wanted us to rehearse that. And so in this class, it gave me the opportunity to rehearse the stories of God's goodness. And then it had this dual purpose of it also provided for those students some stories of God's goodness that maybe they hadn't seen the same kinds of things yet. Maybe in their youth, they'd not had the same opportunities to see God's supernatural intervention in those kinds of ways. And they could borrow my stories until they recognized God's involvement in their lives. So it was really fun to tell those stories. And I'm going to share some of those stories with you today. And I hope that they are really a blessing to you as well. So when I was in elementary school, my dad pastored a very small church, and their model was that they would pay the bills and then they would give dad whatever was left over. And the truth is, a lot of months there wasn't a lot that was left over. And so our family really got into a cycle of living on very little. And we were blessed. My mom has amazing, amazing skills at taking a nickel and turning it into a quarter. She just had a way of figuring out how to make it work on next to nothing. And she did so with a lot of great creativity. She did so with some amazing garage sale skills where she would find the right garage sales and they would help us to get some of the things that we needed, new school clothes, whatever it was that we were looking for. And we got to see some of that happen. I remember that when I was a kid, I was involved in the Awana program at a different church. And at that church, they were excited to tell us about the Awana Olympics. And what that was it was a opportunity for different Awana programs in an area to get together and kind of compete against each other in some of the games that Awana kids were known to participate in. And instead of just playing them inside our group, we would then compete against other churches in the area. And I was so excited when they told us about this. And then they explained that what everybody would need to be involved. And they said that we would each need to have our own pair of tennis shoes or sneakers. And that is when I became pretty crestfallen, because we didn't have tennis shoes at the time. We went to a Christian school where we had to wear dress shoes. And so those were the kinds of shoes we had, were shoes that we could wear to school. And we didn't have sneakers. My mom would find these leather shoes that we would beat up in terrible ways on the playground and playing outside. And my dad would, on a Sunday morning, get us to throw them down the stairs to him. And he would sit in the living room and he would polish our shoes and make them look as good as they can to extend their life. But those were the shoes we had, and they were not sneakers. They were not tennis shoes. And so I told the person who was in charge of my Awana group that we wouldn't be able to participate because we didn't have tennis shoes. And I think it was the next week that somebody handed my mom an envelope. And in the envelope was money so that she could go get the four of us girls sneakers and we could participate in the Awana Olympics. I was so excited to have brand new shoes. They weren't even hand-me-downs. These were brand new shoes. It was God's provision, and I got to see that happen. A couple years later, my twin needed new shoes. The sole of her shoes was peeling away from the uppers, and she went to my mom and said, "Mom, I think I'm going to need new shoes." And my mom said, "Honey, right now, I don't know how we're going to be able to do that, so we should get down on our knees and pray." And they did. They got down on their knees in the living room, and they asked God to provide new shoes for Danelle. And as she prayed, she asked God to give her blue shoes. She didn't want black shoes or brown shoes. She really wanted blue shoes. And it was a couple weeks later in church that a lady walked up to my mom with a bag in her hand. And she said, "You have all of those girls. I wonder if one of them would be able to use these shoes that we were never able to use." And my mom would tell you that she didn't even need to open that bag to know that those shoes were going to be blue. Exactly what my sister had hoped for and had asked her God for. In high school, I went to snow camp. And when I was getting ready for snow camp, I did not have boots. So I had these cheap canvas shoes and I wore them and lots of layers of socks and got through that snow camp. I got back from snow camp and opened my locker one day, and taped inside my locker was an envelope. I thought that was weird because people were not allowed to get in other people's lockers. When I opened the envelope, it had quite a bit of money, and it said, "This is for you to go get yourself some boots." And there was enough money in there that I got new, and I do mean cool boots. It was the late 80s, early 90s. And those boots were these leather boots with these knit insides to them. They were so cool. I was very excited about it. And there was enough money that I was also able to get my sister boots as well, because God cared about my feet. But one of my favorite stories about how God provided shoes for us in supernatural kinds of ways actually related to my senior year volleyball season. The school in which I was playing volleyball decided that year they were going to get matching Mizuno court shoes. And I thought they were so cool, but they were also really expensive. They were $85. And back then, that was a crazy amount of money. And it just wasn't something that was going to be in our budget. And so I told the coach that I would not be able to get the Mizuno shoes, but I was excited for the rest of the team to do that. One of the first games of the year was against Bridgeport Baptist Academy. And as we were warming up before the game, the coach came over and said, "Lynelle, you cannot wear those shoes to play volleyball." She had noticed that the sole was peeling down in the front of my shoes. And every once in a while, I would end up tripping over it. And I was desperate to not be benched. And I said, "Coach, please, please, please let me play tonight. I promise before the next game, I'll find some other shoes. Just please let me play tonight." And she looked at me and she said, "Lynelle, there's some shoes in the back of my van. Go try those." And I knew that our coach had several daughters at home. And I thought maybe one of them had a spare pair of shoes in the van. And when I got to the van, the only pairs of shoes that I found in the van was a brand new pair of Mizuno tennis shoes in my size. And I was so excited because I got to play that game in real volleyball shoes, like real court shoes. It was awesome. And at the end of that game, I sprayed them with some spray deodorant, and I very carefully tucked the laces back in the shoes. And with great gratitude in my heart, I placed them back in my coach's van, just thrilled that I had an opportunity to play volleyball in such amazing shoes for that game. The next practice, that coach came up to me and she said, "Lynelle, about those shoes." And I was terrified. I thought, did I do something to hurt them, to mess them up? And instead, what she said to me is that she wanted me to have those shoes. So I got to play my senior year of high school and 2 years of college volleyball in really, really nice volleyball shoes. And that has always stuck with me, not just because of the generosity of Mrs. Nellis, but it stuck with me because, when the Bible tells us that our God will provide our needs, I didn't need really good shoes. I just needed shoes. I could have played volleyball and pay less shoes. But instead, God let me have the privilege of those seasons of volleyball in some really awesome, awesome shoes. And they were a reminder every time I laced them up of God's love for me, of his goodness to me. And I made sure that every time I tied those shoes, I also prayed for Mrs. Nellis and gave gratitude to God for what she had done. And those are just stories about the things that God did for our feet. And the truth is, I have story after story after story about how God met our family's needs through some really, really lean years in wildly, wildly supernatural ways. My mom and dad would tell you stories about how there was a time when they had some sudden financial needs and they did not know how God could meet those needs. And out of the blue, a cousin and an aunt sent them a check. They had never sent them a check before. They didn't send them a check afterwards. But right at the moment of their need, God provided through that. They'll never forget that. I could remember my parents sitting down with us and saying to us girls that there was no more money until the end of the month, and we didn't have the food that we needed to get us there. So we were going to need to pray. And as a family, we got down on our knees in the living room and we talked to the Lord and we told him about our needs. It was just a couple of days later that another pastor from a local church pulled up in front of our house with a van. And in that van, there was a whole bunch of food that they had provided because they knew that we had a need, because God told them that we had a need. What a blessed reminder of God's gracious provision. And as a child, these stories, these things that I got to watch time after time after time, they left an indelible imprint in me. They told me that I had a God who would recognize the needs that I had, and then he would provide. So when I took that class before Thanksgiving and started to tell these students story after story after story after story about the goodness of God, I got the refreshment to my soul, and I hoped that it was inspirational to them, that it reminded them that they could watch to see God's hand at work in their lives as well. So I entered into adulthood without a lot of fear. I wasn't concerned as much about the financial issues because these are the things that I had seen God do. I did have some concerns. I would share this with my students before Thanksgiving. I would say I'm so grateful that I had this growing up time and I got to see these things because I knew that God would provide. And I would tell them that I was a little worried about that for my kids because they didn't have those same opportunities to see God provide. You see, for the years that my kids were being formed for their elementary school years, their junior high years, the same God was providing for us, but he was doing so in a different way. He was doing so in checks that were signed by Clark Summit University. He was doing so by giving us jobs, and those jobs paid us. Now, let's be honest, they didn't pay us that well because it was a ministry and we were struggling for many of those years. But we had these regular paychecks that came in and they provided for us and they provided for our family. And I was concerned that my kids wouldn't learn the same lessons that I learned. That's one of the things that I shared with them. And then came the summer of 2024. June 1st brought a sudden, unexpected furlough. The truth is that financial issues were not new to the school. We'd been having those for a really long time. In fact, since that recession that started in 2008, there had not been cost of living increases. We had taken a couple different pay cuts. The school was just trying to figure out how to make it work. And this summer, it was even worse than normal. They had to secure some different sources of funding to get us through the summer. So they shared with us that they needed to give a 3-week furlough. They needed to stop paying the faculty and staff for those 3 weeks while they pulled all of that financing together. You know, many of the faculty and staff were just scraping by because it had been several tough years in a row. And so for some of those families, this was a really, really difficult thing where without a paycheck, how are we going to make it? James and I looked at each other and we looked at our savings and we thought that we would be okay. It was just estimated to be 3 weeks. So all we have to do is tighten our belts. We'll be wise about what we spend, but we're going to be okay. During this time, one of the things that we stopped doing was eating out. We didn't go out for meals, and we even stopped one of our rituals of going out to eat on Sunday. For pastors' families, I got to tell you that not very often do we actually want to go home and make a meal after the work of a Sunday morning. And so our family had gotten used to stopping to get food at Dairy Queen or McDonald's or Taco Bell on the way home from church. And so then we could rest. But we stopped doing that because we wanted to make sure that we were wise and we were very, very careful. One of my kids actually said to me at that time, man, I miss when we were rich. And I thought, wait, when was that? When was it that we were rich? I don't remember that part. But what they were really talking about is the fact that we could go out to eat after church and she could call her dad and say, hey, Dad, would you bring me this home from the store? But now we were very carefully evaluating every purchase to make sure that we were going to be okay as we went through this furlough time. Then the furlough was extended. That brought some greater concern. But every time we turned around, God was sending us the money that we needed. And he did so in some ways that just demonstrated that the furlough was not a surprise to him. It might have been to us, but it wasn't to him. In the spring, James had been contacted by a church who asked if he would be willing to do an adult vacation Bible school. And I got to tell you, I didn't even know that was a thing. But he agreed, and it happened to fall during that furlough. And so he went and taught adults during the traditional VBS week. And at the end of that week, we were hoping that they would give him a couple $100. And instead, they didn't give him anything. They said, we're going to take a love offering, and then we'll give you something from the love offering. We didn't know what that was going to be. But it was amazing that the next week, they gave him a check for almost $3,000. That was so unexpected to us, but it wasn't unexpected to our God, who knew that all of this was going to happen. And he knew that he was going to have to find some alternative ways to provide for the Buchanans because their regular source of income was going to dissipate for a little while. We watched some other things happen. A dear one of mine, a dear loved one, pulled me aside, and they handed me a check that was so amazingly generous. It was so kind. And it was money that was going to be critical to supporting us through what we needed to get done. For so many of us during the furlough, our churches were a critical source of support, especially for the single faculty and staff, and for those who had both incomes derived from Clark Summit University. And so many of our local churches stepped up in some very, very special kinds of ways. When the furlough happened, I went out to Michigan to help my parents with a move. And so my daughter went to church without me, and she had people just walk up and hand her envelopes. She brought home from church just envelopes of generous and kind gifts from the people in our churches. What a blessing to us. So we breathed a sigh of relief and gratitude. We were going to make it through the furlough. It was going to be just fine because God had provided in these really, really awesome ways. But then July 1st, a little over a year ago, CSU announced its closure. Now that dissipating income was no longer a temporary problem, it was something that was much, much more permanent, and for so many of us, much more scary. But the same God, the same Jehovah-Jireh, the one who sees and the one who provides, he continued to send his support through the generosity of his people. And even that sometimes came from people who didn't share our faith. We were so privileged to get to know the director of food service at Clark Summit University. He's a great guy, and our kids worked for him in the kitchen there. And they lost their jobs suddenly too. And we reached out to express our condolences. And then when we came back from vacation, we made sure to stop by the kitchen to say goodbye to those people. And when we walked in, that director turned to us and he said, "I sure hope you brought your van." Because he had purchased food for Teen Leadership Conference that he thought he was going to be hosting the next week. But now the school was closed and there was no Teen Leadership Conference. And for that reason, he had freezers full of food prepared for it. And he loaded our van up with eggs and pulled pork and cheese and vegetables. So much, and salmon. So much food that was going to actually help sustain us throughout that whole summer. What a blessing. We were gifted a lot of food. And it didn't just come from the kitchen. It came from other people who gave us venison, and they gave us vegetables. They gave us gift cards to restaurants, more eggs. So many times we had God supernaturally provide for us. I even think that we took a vehicle in for some repairs that should have cost us a lot. And it ended up costing us much less. And I think that was the provision of God as well during those times. We had somebody who gave us 17 tubs so that we could use them for packing up our offices and for our move. That was the provision of God. We were on vacation when the announcement of the closure took place. When I got back to campus, I got this call out of the blue from Johns Hopkins. They have a program called the Center for Talented Youth, and they happened to lose a professor for that program, and somebody had given them my name. And so they called to see if I could teach a 3-week class for smarty pants teenagers. This was Tuesday night. The class started on Saturday night. But when they told me how much it would provide for my family, I knew that that opportunity was God meeting the needs for our family. So I went off to teach that class because God was providing. Before I even left for Johns Hopkins, Cairn University had hired me to do a teach out program for our master's in counseling students from CSU under Cairn's umbrella. We moved our courses and our faculty and our students over there so that our students didn't lose out on any credits. So within 48 hours, I went from unemployed to having a full-time job and also this 3-week program for Johns Hopkins. Like, that was absolutely amazing. But we were still down in income in our household. And there's another story that tells me God knew that was happening too. Because the spring of 2024, I had gotten this call from this camp who they were excited that in October they were going to be hosting a women's conference at their camp. They wanted me to be the speaker, and it was going to be a really great opportunity. I really wanted to do it, but when they told me the dates, they actually coincided with Clark Summit's homecoming. And as a residence director and faculty member, it would not be a great thing to miss homecoming, and I knew it, but I really wanted to do it, but I knew I probably couldn't. So I called the Dean of Women and I said, I'm pretty sure I know what you're going to tell me, but I have this opportunity and I need you to tell me that I need to say no. And she said, well, let's pray about it and talk in a couple days. But 5 minutes later, she called me back and she said, wait a second. We just moved the weekend for homecoming. And I said, what? We always have it the same weekend. And she said, I know. But this year, we couldn't get teams who could play against us the weekend we always have homecoming. So we just moved it a weekend earlier. Now, I'm going to tell you that I believe from the bottom of my heart that God knew that CSU wasn't going to have a homecoming. He could have just left the dates the way they were. But I think he moved homecoming so I could say yes to that speaking engagement, because that was a really helpful way that he provided for our family last fall. And it was really fun. I missed the classroom so much. So being able to go and teach women in a live setting, super duper fun. Friends, these are not all the stories. These are certainly not all the stories that my family experienced and got to see God provide for us. And if we were to reach into the broader Clark Summit University community, I can tell you there are some amazing stories out there. Because in the middle of our loss, our God knew what our needs were. And he, in supernatural kinds of ways, in wild ways, he has met our needs. The thing that was different about this one is this time, my kids got to have a front row seat to the need and to God's provision. The thing that I had been concerned about for all those years, will my kids know that God has been the one who's provided the whole time? God certainly gave them an opportunity to learn those lessons over and over and over again as he provided for us. And that in and of itself is so priceless to me. I'm so grateful for that. All of this proved that in those really, really dark hours, my God was intimately involved and purposeful. He was good and loving, and he was absolutely fully faithful, knowing what was coming and providing for us. So I guess if I was going to distill this down to a few lessons, I think there's 3 takeaways for me from all of this that God has done. Number 1 is that the things that surprise us do not surprise our God. And so many times when we get into a moment and we can't imagine how we're going to get through the next little bit, and I definitely felt that way, God has known what was coming, and he knew what it was going to take. I'm so grateful that the things, the battles, the threats that looked so big and giant to me, they were not big to my God. They were things that he already had an answer for. And I'm so grateful for that. I'm grateful that he goes before us and that he has the power to be able to meet those needs, even before we know that we have those needs. Then we can just look back in hindsight and marvel, absolutely marvel at how God orchestrated and wove together these amazing circumstances in our lives. Number 2, God did not just leave us to contend with a financial need on our own. And I don't know if I will ever get over this, but he surrounded us with his people, the ones who listened to his prompting and who poured out with such amazing generosity their love onto the CSU family. Those things were so precious to us in that time. And I'm not sure anybody would even understand the depths of what it meant to us, because for many of us, it was very difficult for us to even understand, deal with our own emotional experience, much less to share it with others. But I'm so grateful that God moves through his people. And the third lesson for me is that God's people who do pour out that generosity, they prompt in others worship and gratitude. They are conduits of God's grace that actually ends up enhancing the relationships that the others have with God. They remind us of our dependence, and they just make worship and gratitude pour out of us. I mean, have you thought about that? That our generosity to others can actually enhance somebody's walk with God. They can help them grow spiritually. What a wild thing to come out of a gift that we could offer to somebody else. For those of you who are watching that were part of how God provided for us, we can't say thank you enough. You overwhelmed us, and you absolutely drove us to our knees in gratitude and worship of our God. Thank you. And I will even be bold enough to tell you that I think I can represent the broader CSU community and tell you we all thank you. It meant so much to us. But what it does for me too is it's a good reminder that I need to be doing that same thing for others. I need to be watching for the needs that God might have equipped me to be able to meet, because I want to be that for others. I want to be able to say, here's blessing that I can pour onto you. And it might warm your heart of worship to the Lord. It might prompt your gratitude. It might enhance your relationship with God. I want to be able to do that. I want to watch for those needs. I want to be open to how God might lead my heart, might prompt me to meet the needs of others. And so I guess that would be my challenge to you this week too. If you think about, first of all, your needs, and you probably have a different list than my needs would be, but I think we all have needs. We recognize those things. Could I encourage you? You don't have to get down on your knees to do it, but take those needs to your God, because I do believe with all of my heart that we serve a God who sees, who understands those needs, and then he can provide. So turn to him, watch for his hand at work in your life, because I promise there are things that he is doing, ways that he is working. And then my challenge is listen to him, to his leading, to find others that you might be able to bless, that you might be able to encourage, lift, carry. I'm reminded of the story that I learned in flannel graph. Flannel graph was the way that they taught Bible lessons back in the day. And I remember in children's church or Sunday school, somebody teaching the story of as the Israelites were in battle, and when Moses held up his hands, they would win. They would be successful. And when he put his hands down, then they would cease being successful. And so alongside of him, two men came and they held up his hands to help him in his point of need. And I think there have been so many who have held up our hands over the last year. Maybe there's somebody around you who you can strengthen. You can help hold up their hands. And I think that would be a valuable lesson. That's my challenge. And my goal would be that then God would be glorified in everything that comes next.
If you enjoyed what you just heard, we invite you to like the episode and, if possible, leave a positive review. If you know someone who could benefit from this content, please share it on your social media. We also ask that you subscribe and follow so that you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes. We are so glad that you chose to be with us today. We hope that you will join us again next week on The Theological Lens.